Welcome to the 2018-19 City of Richmond Rent Program Annual Report. Let's begin by discussing the purpose and mission of the Rent Program. The mission of the Rent Program is to promote neighborhood and community stability, healthy housing, and affordability for Richmond tenants through the regulating of those landlord-tenant matters that reasonably relate to rents and evictions while maintaining a landlord's right to a fair return. Community stability, then, is supported by healthy housing, housing stability, housing affordability, and a landlord's right to a fair return on their investment. So, what is the link between healthy housing and community stability? Studies cited in our annual report show the connection between unhealthy housing conditions and significant physical and psychological stressors that negatively affect the most vulnerable community members. As seen in this Venn diagram, physical and mental exposure to unhealthy housing conditions negatively impacts life success and leads to additional societal costs. Thus, unhealthy living conditions lead to physical and psychological dysfunction, which contributes to an unhealthy and dysfunctional community. So how does housing stability impact the health of the community? Housing stability improves financial stability, academic and job performance, and family and community cohesion. And of course, this leads to better health outcomes. Better health outcomes further reinforces these positive effects. Finally, housing affordability plays an important role in improving residents' health. Tenants who pay a higher share of their income to rent tend to have less money left over for food, medicine, healthcare, and utility costs. This can mean difficult and unhealthy trade-offs where people have to choose between paying rent and adhering to their basic needs. The key to effectuating the purpose of the ordinance is active enforcement. There are three components to active enforcement of the rent ordinance. The first is property enrollment and tenancy registration. The second is the rent adjustment petition process. And the third is community education. The first component of actively enforcing the rent ordinance is accurately recording all rental properties and their associated tenancies. In fact, there is a higher compliance with the rent ordinance when there is an accurate accounting of all rental units in Richmond and when landlords and tenants are on the same page about what the lawful rent is. Now let's look at property enrollment and tenancy registration by the numbers. In fiscal year 2018-19, we mailed out 5,277 property enrollment packets. We enrolled 3,002 properties, and billing and registration staff performed 1,684 consultations. The rent adjustment petition process is the second way that the rent ordinance is enforced. Through the rent adjustment process, tenants can compel landlords to provide habitable, healthy housing by petitioning the rent board to decrease their rent until the habitability problems are corrected. And landlords can petition for a fair return rent increase to offset increased maintenance costs or perform capital improvements. Now let's look at rent adjustment petitions by the numbers. We had 832 consultations with the hearings unit coordinator, 31 settlement agreements reached, 8 individual rent decreases ordered, and 2 individual rent increases ordered. Perhaps nothing is more important to enforcing the rent ordinance than community education. Enforcement with the ordinance starts with education. Tenants and landlords who understand their rights are more likely to comply with the law. Now let's look at community outreach and education by the numbers. We had 406 community workshop participants. We counseled 8,345 landlords and tenants on their rights and responsibilities under the rent ordinance. We referred 94 households to legal aid assistance, and we conducted 67 landlord-tenant mediation. Now it's time to provide a profile of rental housing in Richmond. Around 40% of the rental stock is considered fully covered by the rent ordinance, meaning both control and just cause eviction requirements apply. The other 60% of rental units, including governmentally subsidized housing, are partially covered, meaning they are covered by the rent ordinance's eviction protections but are not rent controlled. More specifically, there are 7,802 fully covered rental units and 11,457 partially covered rental units. Included in the count of partially covered rental units are 4,211 governmentally subsidized units. About 1/3 of all rental housing units in Richmond are single-family homes and condominiums, which are covered by the requirement to have just cause to evict, but are generally exempt from rent control. The high proportion of single-unit rental properties in Richmond means that the rent program must dedicate a significant amount of time and resources to helping landlords and tenants navigate the rent ordinance's just cause for eviction requirements. Over 20% of Richmond's rental housing stock is considered affordable housing. This includes approximately 2,782 units built with low-income housing tax credits, also known as LIHTC, and 991 units that receive HUD project-based rental assistance, and 1,686 with housing choice vouchers from the local housing authority. There are 25 affordable housing developments in Richmond. In accordance with Rent Board Regulation 202, affordable housing is exempt from rent control, but subject to just cause for eviction protections and associated relocation payment requirements. Tenants and landlords of affordable housing can seek assistance from the rent program with eviction issues and request mediation to resolve conflicts. In February of 2019, the Rent Board reached an agreement with affordable housing providers and adopted a resolution limiting rent increases in certain LIHTC units to 5% annually to better protect low-income residents. Now let's look at data on Richmond landlords. Most landlords in Richmond are based locally and own a small number of rental units. The fact that Richmond has more landlords compared to most rent-controlled cities means that there has to be a greater focus on outreach in order to achieve compliance. In fact, there are 5,716 landlords in Richmond. 88% of those landlords live in the Bay Area. 27% live in Richmond, and 92% of all Richmond landlords own fewer than 5 rental units. Let's now look at rent increase data for rent-controlled units in Richmond. A total of 2,476 rent increase notices were filed during fiscal year 2018-19. The allowed rent increase for 2019 was 3.6%. Based on information submitted to the rent program, the median increase for rent-controlled units was $56, with median rents rising to $1,525. Now let's look at termination of tenancy data. In fiscal year 2018-19, a total of 4,211 notices of termination of tenancy were filed with the rent program. Approximately 96% of those notices were for non-payment of rent. Approximately 3% were for breach of lease or nuisance. About 1% were for other just causes. Finally, let's look at the rent program's financial status for fiscal year 2018-19. In fiscal year 18-19, the rent program balanced its budget and ended the fiscal year in the black. To plan for the future, the rent program is developing a 5-year financial plan. Finally, to ensure that all unpaid rental housing fees are collected, the rent program has undertaken a robust collection effort.